I'm Holly Reynolds, Senior Product Designer on the Plan team in the Project Management Group. Today, I'm going to be talking about planning objects discovery work that we've done recently. This is an unrehearsed presentation. I normally like to give it at least a good run through first, but just ran out of time this time. So I apologize for ums and any awkward pauses as I get my thoughts together. And also for the kind of blandness of the slides there, but we'll get through it. So this is a kind of a cautionary tale as well. I love that Austin kicked us off with one because I also have one where I feel like I've learned a lot of lessons this particular project. Just to give a quick overview of what we were looking to accomplish here, and the epic is in the agenda. We had this initiative resulting from kind of a culmination of ideas from a couple of large issues and an epic, which included converting plan objects such as issues and epics to issue types, which we already have a kind of a base for that in place, in that we have issues and incidents. But converting planning objects to kind of expand on those issue types, exploring possibilities surrounding making issues extensible so that customers can kind of customize the interface and add and remove widgets as they see fit. And then finally, creating a new collaboration object view. And it was broken into 4 iterations. We have just finished the 2nd iteration, so it's currently ongoing work. And in this particular showcase, I'll just touch on what we've learned and kind of discovered as part of the first 2. So to summarize, the engineers were planning to refactor the issue view into a single view app for performance reasons. And we were exploring possibilities to maybe improve the user experience and add in some additional possibilities surrounding that. We were calling it a collabject, which was kind of a tongue-in-cheek term. We've defined it now as a planning object. Not sure if that's going to be the final label for it, but that's what we're calling it currently. So if you look into the epics and issues, you'll see those terms kind of used interchangeably. We also wanted to prepare for an expansion to multiple planning object types, those issue types that I had talked about, and kind of expanding into offering things like bugs and features and some of the other types of issues that users have requested before, but then also setting us up to make those extensible again. And finally, explore child elements for planning objects, which is actually going to be part of the upcoming research a bit more than what we've done so far. And actually, let me go back really quick. So we wanted to create a new planning object and explore ways to improve the experience. Again, part of it was engineering focused, part of it was UX and product focused. We wanted to start with a blank slate. That was something that was kind of being encouraged throughout this initial process, was let's take a large chunk of time, about, I think it was about 4 to 6 weeks, actually closer to 6 weeks, and start with a blank slate. If we had a blank template for a planning object, what would that look like? What are the problems that we might want to solve, knowing that we weren't going to address all of them for MVC, but just to kind of be thinking long-term and kind of larger vision. We wanted to understand what the core item was that everything else might be built upon, what its purpose was, how it affects other objects in the product. We had a lot of questions come out of this. The desired outcome was to converge on a structure for planning objects that gets us close to the goal to stand out amongst our competitors. So essentially, we wanted to just explore ways to improve collaboration that helps to set us apart from our competitors as part of this initial research based on UX opportunities with this new planning object. We already knew our users pretty well. Parker, Delaney, and Sasha were who we were focusing on. We already had a lot of good research to kind of help support some of the ideas that were explored here. So we had done research previously. I had done research for sticky headers, for the jobs to be done validation, category maturity, on issue tracking. So as a result of all of that, we had a lot of feedback from users about what works and what doesn't work, as well as from SUS. I looked at that as well, and there were a lot of good pieces of information from users there about how we could improve the collaboration experience. So keeping in mind the desired outcome of exploring a structure for planning objects that would help to increase those chances of standing out against our competitors, There were 3 how might we statements defined, which were to explore making, how might we make it more efficient to understand what's changed or what's new since the last time I interacted with the planning object. How might we take the outcomes of threaded discussions and efficiently capture them in the description as a single source of truth? And how might we reduce the amount of context switching between the sort of core concepts within the planning objects, such as title and description, and the discussion, as well as between the planning object and other planning objects or other parts of the product. We met synchronously. This was defined up front. We would meet synchronously twice a week and present design ideas for each session. Again, this was more discovery, not yet necessarily defining anything, but we did realize early on that we, of course, want to have some sort of MVC to come out of it. So that was also keeping in mind as we were doing this exploration that we needed to have something to come out of it of value. During these discussions, we determined the first 2 how might we's were valuable, but not necessarily critical for MVC. So for my part, in these first 2 iterations, a lot of the focus was on reducing the amount of context switching. And so I explored a lot of layout possibilities and decided on testing reducing context switching as kind of the main focus. And I'll show some examples of that in just a moment. And actually, let me go ahead and share. Am I sharing my whole monitor or just the Figma? Can you still see everything?
I just see Figma.
You do see Figma. Good. Okay, let me open this up a little bit. Perfect. Thank you.
It is your whole desktop, which is fine.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. I know it's large. It's very large, and I'm sorry about that. I'll zoom in just to touch on a few key points. So again, there was a lot of exploration, and I also referenced in the agenda some user flows that we created. There were a lot of insights that I had pulled into an affinity diagram and groups that I didn't include in the agenda, but I'm happy to share that too. I'm not going to go through all of the stuff that we have explored so far, but I'll just touch on some of the key things that we were looking to kind of discuss and understand. One was the possibility of keeping context when interacting with these objects. So in the example I explored here, we had maybe a to-do list. You wanted to perhaps select an item from the to-do list, and rather than leaving that context and going to a different page, you could have kind of a portion of that planning object come out from the side and present the information there, as well as having some of the same features that we currently have, such as viewing assignees, accessing labels. One of the aspects of this that I wanted to dig into to help reduce the kind of up and down scrolling was truncating the description. So in the research, we had found previously that users didn't care as much about the description as they did about the title and the discussion. So reducing that, but giving them the option to kind of show a full version if they wanted to, and that way comments would always be visible kind of toward the top of the screen in this sort of simplified view. And happy to go into this deeper if anybody wants to see it kind of one-on-one, but that was part of it. Use of progressive disclosure to simplify the UX and reduce clutter. So going more to an icon approach here, which I'm personally a big fan of having labels with icons. So I did include tooltips as part of this, but that's hover only and not necessarily mobile friendly. So still opportunities there to dig deeper. But again, just discovery and exploration initially. Helping users to establish a single source of truth. So this was maybe taking something that we're currently doing in the handbook and providing the ability for someone to maybe select a portion of text and then quickly choose to add it to the description. And maybe in the description, there would be something to kind of visually denote it as being, this was added from a comment. So again, some of that kind of high level exploration, as well as the detail view, maybe exploring some ways to have a side-by-side layout. So maybe having the title and some of the key meta information, as well as the description on one side with comments on the other side. So you could see both at all times together and not necessarily have to do all of that up and down scrolling. Possibly also even having this kind of bar in the middle be something like in Storybook where you can drag it left to right so that if you have just a small description but a lot of dialogue, you can kind of expand that to see more of that information and have that kind of control. So those were some of the things that we started to explore, and this is just a portion of it for this view. We ended up narrowing it down to some things that we wanted to initially test. So on usertesting.com, I created a prototype of the to-do list view, and we decided after a lot of discussion on presenting a modal approach as well as a sidebar approach here for accessing this, and then also this sort of full screen view. So I tested with 7 participants and had them kind of describe what they see with each interaction. The way that they would access this would be through the ellipsis menu in the top right. So if they are in the side panel view, they could switch to the modal view. If they are in the modal view, they could switch to the side panel view. They could switch to full screen from either. And then if they are in the kind of full detail view, they wouldn't have the option to switch necessarily to modal or sidebar, because obviously we would need to understand the context of where they were in order for that to work. So that was some of the initial testing that was done, as well as getting feedback on kind of this layout showing side by side as well. So let me go back to the presentation and I'll touch on some of the insights and some of what we learned from this. So our users were pretty evenly divided on which approach they liked, which I thought was a good thing, because that helped us to understand that people find value in each approach for different reasons. And I think context also matters. A lot of the users were excited. They exited the issue. So if I asked them in the instructions to show me a couple of different ways that they might want to view this particular layout, they had a tendency to exit the modal or sidebar view and go back to the main to-do view, as if they were expecting kind of a global setting. And one person actually verbalized, I was expecting something maybe on this main page that kind of defined a layout view for all of these objects across the board. Or even potentially, I think one person also expressed, depending on the context. So if you're in a board view, I might expect to set the view for all issues, for example, to be in a sidebar. But if I'm on iterations or in a list view, perhaps I want them to always show in a modal view. So that was something that we got some good feedback on. Most expressed that the information felt a little scrunched in the sidebar and in the modal view. So there's further opportunity to explore what's going to be most valuable in those views and why that is. Does it really help solve the problem of context switching as well? And then a lot of users, interestingly, tried to click the open status, thinking that it was a button, and verbalized, oh, I assume if I click this open, then it's going to open a new issue. So they misinterpreted that, which I know is a separate discussion that we've been talking about as far as that status and its design. What I really want to touch on here more than anything, though, to be honest, is the lessons that were learned from this. It was a great lesson in scope management for me. I have no interest in pointing fingers. I accept full responsibility for the areas that I had to improve in this. What I should have done looking back was step up when I saw the scope growing and pushed back. And I didn't necessarily do that because we had a lot of great ideas coming in. And everyone felt that the ideas that were being discussed were going to be very important for MVC, but the scope was just getting bigger and bigger. So this was a great lesson for me to learn. This was also a culmination of a few big ideas. So we started big from the start, and knowing that we focused on high-level discovery and not necessarily defining MVC initially, but time passes and ideas keep growing. And at some point, we have to focus on something that's going to provide value. So establishing a North Star vision early on was important. Then establishing smaller how might we statements were important, but making sure that those were measurable, that they were clearly articulated, that they were agreed upon was also really important to do. And I think there were some opportunities there. The sync meetings and demos that we conducted were helpful to keep us on track, but doing that in addition to async in the issues was a bit harder, because then we were kind of doing double and triple effort in terms of documentation. So that was unfortunately a bit lost. While we had it recorded and documented in agendas, it was not necessarily always in the issues, and that was a missed opportunity. Staying focused again on the North Star vision and smaller statements would have helped us to stay on track across the board. and help us to, ensure that we were focused on the right things as priorities changed and ideas were shaped. We should have acknowledged big ideas and tabled them. So said, yes, that's a great idea, but let's create a follow-up issue and then explore that later rather than trying to explore them all up front. And again, I think setting a good goal would have been helpful for that too. Write down the agreed upon scope. So not just defining it and agreeing on it in the conversations, but also putting it in an issue and saying, here's what we have defined, which we did in some cases, but I think there was still opportunity to further clarify that. As with Austin, better cross-stage collaboration was also important. There was a concern about having too many cooks in the kitchen too early on before we really had some semblance of a scope. So we didn't pull more folks in sooner. I did pull a couple of folks in, but I learned that it's less about having too many voices too soon and more about managing that feedback and managing the steps associated with it, which is partly why I chose to share this today. To go ahead and get it out there. I want to hear that feedback, but of course not everything may be something we can accomplish for MVC. We did also conduct a retro in the first iteration, which was helpful as well. So for next steps, we're in kind of the converge stage from the first two iterations. We're looking to define exactly what will be MVC, but decisions will be impacted by the work done in the other two iterations as well. So that's something that Alexis and I will be working on together. We'll be exploring possibilities of establishing and surfacing related items, not only from the perspective of related and blockers, but also child elements for planning objects, and then looking into customization for these items. Again, still very big, but it's been a valuable learning experience. And I don't think the work was throwaway work by any means. But I do think that there were a lot of good opportunities that I understood as a result of all of this to improve my own process going forward. So that was all that I had today. Again, I've got links in the agenda. If you have anything that you would like to comment on, please feel free to do so. I welcome the feedback.
Awesome. Thank you, Holly. There's a good README read only that's worth reading only. In the meantime, Christy, you had a question.
Yeah, I understand that you're very much still in the design phase of this, but I wonder how you are thinking about this in the context of smaller screen sizes, since we know that issue management is one of the key things that our users want to do on mobile and tablet. And it feels like thinking about that now, even while you're just in the initial exploration phases, might make it much easier for you to make decisions.
Agree, and that's a great question. I would expect it to be very similar to if we go with a panel view, for example, that's a little smaller in width than the modal view. I would expect it to be the same pretty much in that area, so we can reuse that code. And yes, we are thinking about it. So yeah, I don't know if that's going to address your specific question, but yes, we are thinking about it, and I would expect it to be similar to what we would have in that side panel view.
Yeah, I mean, it's because it sounds like you're still making really a decision between panel and modal. And I start thinking about, well, when you're on smaller devices, what's a better experience? Modals aren't a great experience on small devices. So maybe this starts to kind of help you cut through the cruft of that.
Well, honestly, I think where I feel we could pursue is having both as an option and letting the user choose which one is going to be more useful. And again, I think there's more opportunity to validate that. Just the feedback that I got from recent testing, though, was that some people prefer the modal view because they want to not leave their current context, but also not have the noise of the page around them. And others say, I need to be able to see, like in a board setting, the information that's on the page in addition to the information that's in the issue. So I kind of like the thought of giving them the choice to toggle between the two. But in terms of where we would start, I think that starting with a side panel view probably would be better simply for the mobile experience, and keeping that in mind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, I think maybe you had the next question.
Yes, thanks for this great overview, Holly. Really good to see your process. You pretty much responded my previous question, with Chrissy's. But yeah, beyond usability testing, how do you see yourself prioritizing between these different options for users that might prefer one option or maybe their use case means another option is different from them. Because I see we frequently bump into customization as a topic here in GitLab because our interface is so heavy and so broad. So this is really interesting, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this.
When you talk about the sort of options for the users, are you specifically referring to the modal view versus the side panel view, or some of the other points that were addressed?
Mostly these two, but another thing that comes to mind, for example, for truncating the description, right? Like at which point do you think is more relevant to truncate the description? Is that they use an option for the user, or is that's a choice that we would make for them?
The default state.
Yeah.
If that's that's a great question. So I think that the usertesting.com that I did was with non-users, but people who still fell into our target persona group. I think there's still value, and I am planning to pursue getting feedback from people internally, as well as preferably customers, people who are familiar with our issue layouts and understand kind of what each of the pieces mean. I think that will also be insightful to help us to know which one might be the preferred approach. I think that the preferred approach, though, is going to depend on context. That's a hypothesis I have that I would like to validate, because I think that there's going to be a difference in how people want to interact with these things in a board setting versus in a list setting, for example. That's a theory that I have. I would say, though, that in order to be less intrusive, I think it would be better to offer the side panel view initially so that the user can choose to view it alongside the other content or not. It's also a pattern that I have seen used more so with our competitors. So I did look at several different competitors, and a lot of them do this side panel approach. So it's familiar to the users. It's something that I think a lot of them already have an expectation for in terms of interaction. So
Right.
that would be my recommendation in terms of a default, and part of the reason why I would base it on that.
Right. Thanks for that.